Everybody, I think we'll go ahead and get started with this afternoon's public listening session. So thank you all for coming to today's session. This is the third in a series of 5 in terms of the Future of Transportation Commission and the work that they're doing. So hopefully some of you are signed up to speak today. A little bit of the context about the game plan here today. So what we're going to do, we're fortunate to have Secretary Pollack here of MassDOT here today. She's going to frame the commission's activities. As a commissioner herself, she's going to outline what the commission is, but also what the commission is not tasked with doing as part of the work. We've got a short little video that introduces the commission itself. And then to help us frame today's discussion, we'd invite a couple of panelists who are experts in the field of today's topic and theme of transit, active transportation, and mobility as a service. They'll offer some remarks, and we'll go from there, and then we'll open it up to everybody for public comment. One other thing that I wanted to mention before I forgot, afterwards, if folks would like, since we're here on the Lowell campus, the idea of these sessions was to try to have one of these sessions in and around each of the 5 UMass campuses. Afterwards, there's going to be a tour of the Raytheon UMass lab. It's in the building, the shiny building, just on the other side of the bridge there. It's where they do a lot of work in terms of radars and communication technology, and anybody that would like to go and participate in that tour is welcome to do so after the session ends. We'll let folks chat for a little bit, but then we'll congregate right outside the door as part of that. And I would be remiss if I also did not thank and acknowledge. Is it not on? Thank and acknowledge our host for today. Our colleagues from the University of Massachusetts Lowell were gracious enough to make this great space available to us. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and kick this off with the video that the commission has put together.
Transportation in the Commonwealth is not important for what it is, but rather for what it does. Gets people where they need to go and shapes the economy of communities. But transportation as we know it is changing through advancements in technology like ride-sharing programs and autonomous vehicles, shifts in the state's demographics with an aging population, and changes in the environment with more frequent major weather events.
Earlier this year, I issued an executive order establishing the Commission on the Future of Transportation in the Commonwealth to address these and other challenges that Massachusetts may face in the future. This diverse team of 19 cross-sector leaders will help us better develop policy and make informed transportation decisions based on how changes in technology, climate, land use, and our economy will affect transportation patterns and the needs of constituents.
The governor has asked this commission to do something that is very unusual for state government. It's to look 20 years in the future. It's not looking at today, it's not looking at a year from now, 3 years from now, 5 years from now. 5 years from now for most of state government is a long time away. We're doing something that is very unusual, and to think about what the world might be 20 years from now.
It's a fascinating time in transportation. Technology is changing, the demographics of the people we serve are changing, our climate is even changing, and the Commission can really help MassDOT and the MBTA understand how to account for all those changes as we operate our services and as we make investments for the future.
The work of the Transportation Commission will be hugely influential on the future work of energy and environmental affairs, because currently transportation accounts for up to 40% of the greenhouse gas emissions across the Commonwealth. As we transition into a more electrified transportation fleet, this will be hugely helpful in us trying to meet the terms of our carbon reduction goals. The work will also help us to make the transportation network, the physical structures that exist today, be more resilient and more adapted to the forces of a changing climate.
Well, I think that transportation is really the cornerstone to our economy. You know, we have to move people, we have to move goods, we have to just make sure the economy thrives, and transportation is so critical to that. To me, the most exciting element of the Commission's work is the fact that we can look to the future and aspire to the transportation system that we all want.
I look forward to working with all of you as we build a stronger, better, forward-looking transportation system here in Massachusetts.
Share your thoughts and suggestions, and learn about our public engagement sessions at mass.gov/Future of Transportation.
right, and with that, I'll turn the floor over to Secretary Pollack to offer some introductory remarks on today's session as well as the work of the commission.
Thank you. What I wanted to just do is to, go into a little more detail than we were able to do in the introductory video about what the commission is and is not. The commission was created by Governor Baker in January by an executive order and tasked with giving him recommendations by December 1st of this year. The commission has broken its work into 3 sort of phases, which will overlap. The first has been collecting information, data and trend information about what different people think is going to be happening in the coming decades in transportation in a variety of different areas. So with respect to autonomous vehicles, with respect to electrification, not just electric cars, but broader electrification of the entire transportation system, about our topic for today, which is the future of transit and the future of so-called mobility as a service, which I'm going to come back to in a moment, about how is the Commonwealth itself going to change, what's land use going to be like, how are demographics going to change, and finally how climate and resiliency, as Secretary Beaton discussed in the video, are going to be changed in the future. So that's been part one, is just getting ourselves up to speed on data and trends. The second effort that's been ongoing has been a scenario planning effort in which the commission is working with some wonderful folks from the Transportation Research Board, which is the part of the National Academy of Sciences that's devoted to transportation, to undertake some scenario planning exercises to think about not just one but several plausible scenarios for the future that we can use to then help us think about, well, if this is the way 2040 might be in terms of technology, land use, whatever, then what kind of recommendations, and that really is the heart of the commission's work, is to make recommendations to the governor. So it is important, and while obviously I want to thank my fellow commission members. To my left, these are 4 of the members of our commission who have joined us for today, for taking the time out of their busy schedules, not only for the commission meetings, but to attend some of these listening sessions. So obviously anything you have to say, we're here to listen to today, but what's particularly helpful maybe is if I can talk a little bit about what we are and aren't going to be doing, and if you can help us think about what we're focused on. So the commission is, as its chairman, Steve Kadish, mentioned in the video, we're focused on the future. We're not going to have any recommendations about this year or next year or the year after that. There are a variety of opportunities through my agency, the Massachusetts Department of Transportation, through Secretary Beaton's agency, to weigh in on more immediate issues that may be on your mind, but we've sort of set ourselves a discipline we don't even want to think about before 2020. We want to really focus on sort of 2021 to 2040. The second thing is it is about the whole Commonwealth. So that's a good thing, and it means that the governor is pushing us and we're pushing ourselves to sort of think about how the different transportation futures will play out in more urban parts of the state, in more rural parts of the states, in suburban communities, in places that maybe are currently very prosperous, and maybe in places right now that are currently facing some more challenges. That means that we're not going to be able to do sort of any deep dives into specific areas. We're not likely to make recommendations to the governor about do this here, do this there, but we have made a commitment to each other that we will make sure that our recommendations do cover the gamut of types of communities without getting into too much detail. And the other thing that the commission is going to be doing is making these recommendations largely at a policy level, not really focus on planning exercises. My agency does a ton of planning. We're currently doing statewide, we just released the statewide rail plan and the statewide freight plan. We're currently doing a statewide bicycle plan, a statewide transportation plan, a statewide water transportation plan. So that kind of planning exercise is beyond the scope and capacity of the commission. Commission's also not going to look at specific projects. You know, should we build this thing that people are thinking about in this place? So it's really policy level. So again, while we're delighted to be here in Lowell and very thankful to UMass System has actually been our hosts for all 5 of our listening sessions, which both means we've had wonderful venues, great public participation, and great insights from faculty members. We really are here to hear what you have to say, but the more you can help us share your thoughts about what you think about when you think about the future of transportation, and stay away from some of the more granular planning and project work, the more we'll be able to incorporate your thoughts as the commission begins to turn to recommendations later in the year. So thank you all for coming, and thank you to my fellow commission members for making the time to come, and I'm going to turn it back to Mike to moderate the conversation with our guest professors.
Thank you, Secretary. So as mentioned in the open, the idea here was to contextualize the conversation a bit by asking some of our panelists to offer some opening remarks to the way we frame this. Is we've asked them to ask something thought-provoking, offer some insights on ways or things that we might be thinking about as we move forward with respect to transit, active transportation, or mobility as a service. So with that said, it gives me great privilege to introduce our first panelist today, is Professor Eric Gonzalez at the University of Massachusetts. He has his doctorate from the University of California at Berkeley. He's been doing a ton of work in the area of public transportation over the years, along with freight and logistics and several other areas of expertise. Eric wears many hats, as you'll find out in just a bit. And with that, Eric, the floor is yours.
Is this one working?
Yeah,
it's a little easier for me to speak while standing, I think. Thank you so much for the opportunity to share some thoughts with you today. And before talking about transit specifically, I think it's worth remembering a point that was made actually in the film, which is that it's easy to sort of fall into the thinking that we need more transit, we need to promote these certain things because it'll be more efficient, we'll get these. But what we're really trying to go after is what transit gives us, not transit in and of itself, but we want the mobility that it affords. We want the efficiencies, the energy, low energy consumption, low cost effectiveness that we think it embodies. But there are other modes that can do that as well, right? So active modes, walking and cycling, are other things that should be in sort of the range of things that we're thinking about when we're thinking about how we serve cities in the future. So, bring this back to transit. I think it's worth thinking sort of historically about the role that transit has had in our cities and communities, and that it really developed in response to some of the shortcomings that we had in transportation as people were mostly getting around by walking and cities were growing and there was a need to move further distances faster. There was a market that developed that the private sector initially entered, offering omnibus services to carry people further distances. And so although it grew out of a private sector solution to the problem, over time it became something that was brought into the public sector to promote public benefits and the public good and public organization. And as a consequence of the transit investments that were made, it really changed the way that people traveled over time. And it changed the way, not just the travel behaviors, but also the way we build cities and we use land and structure our activities in space and time. And I make this point because transit investments have long-lasting impacts, sometimes a lot longer than the initial infrastructure construction themselves, is the idea that once you put a line down and people build their lives around that, that has momentum that can last for many decades or centuries. So in Massachusetts, of course, Boston has the oldest subway in the United States, over 120 years now, the Green Line, and we're still using it in very much the same form that it was when it first opened. And so it's worth thinking about the decisions that were made that long ago are still having implications today. And that the decisions that we make today may have implications much longer than the time horizon of even 20 years that we're thinking about. And so these things matter in sort of the big picture of how we want our city to be. What transit fundamentally does, and there's a lot of different ways to define it and cut it and dice it, but it's a way of trying to bring people together to use resources collectively and more efficiently. And so you can think about a bus or a train, and if it operates on a schedule to certain stops, we have to group people's travel behaviors in space to get to those stations and in time to get to the vehicle at the time it's going to board. So we require that people deviate from what they would have necessarily done on their own to collectively get into that vehicle at the same time. And what they get in exchange is a more efficient use of resources, right? If you fill a bus with people, you're using less fuel, less energy. It should cost less money per trip served, and so you get some efficiencies out of this. And it turns out that these efficiencies work out really well when you have a dense level of demand. So in dense urban areas, you can easily fill buses and trains with stops spaced closely, routes laid out close to each other and short headways. And transit operates most efficiently when you have a dense and steady demand. So rural areas, spread out suburban areas, these are places where we have challenges using conventional transit solutions to meet our needs. We also have challenges with peaks in demand. So transit plays a key role in serving peak commute trips into our urban centers. But we have to build up a lot of capacity, infrastructure capacity for the morning and afternoon peaks that ends up getting underutilized during other times of the day. And that's a challenge that we have to deal with, just in the sense that we don't use all of our infrastructure uniformly. When it comes down to it, one of the reasons that we rely so heavily on transit and that it often comes up as a solution to promoting sustainable transportation is because when it's working well, it yields a lot of benefits. We can certainly achieve efficiencies, economies of scale, that as lots of people share the resources, that becomes efficient. The capacity that it allows to move people into small geographic areas facilitates agglomeration economies that have huge implications for our economy. So it's hard to imagine the commercial center in Boston and academic institutions and medical research institutions existing in the form that they do without a transportation center that can get that many people to the same place every day. And we keep seeing prophecies about telecommunications, removing the need to be in one place or another, but we all hauled ourselves here today to see each other face to face, and it seems like over time these are supplementing and not really replacing our need to get to one place. Another important role of transit is to offer choices and alternatives. Sometimes it's touted as a solution to congestion. We certainly still have plenty of congestion in the Boston area, but in the corridors where there's a transit alternative, there are choices for people. And that allows the system to operate in a more resilient way, that if there's a disruption in one system, the traffic system, that people have choices in certain contexts to do something else. And without transit, you end up having a less resilient system. And a last point that I think is a really important one is that in a lot of ways, transit is a tool for social equity and for inclusion, in providing mobility to people across socioeconomic spectrum, age range, and physical ability to get around. So that in a lot of communities, the transit system is really key for making sure that we have an inclusive economy that provides access and mobility to all. In terms of the transit modes, I like to think of the types of transit systems that are out there on a continuum of flexibility that you could have. On the one extreme, very heavy infrastructure like a fixed rail. You lay down the tracks, you build the stations, and you publish a schedule, and it doesn't change. It doesn't change very much even from year to year. And on the other end, you could have full flexibility, like you use your own car. And in between, there's a lot of different possible solutions that maybe haven't been fully realized to date, but as technologies develop, we have a lot more choices and opportunities. We could design systems that are more flexible at where they stop, or deviate the route in response to transportation needs. And in the realm of demand-responsive transit, we've been operating basically dial-a-ride or paratransit systems for people with disabilities and other groups that rely on phone reservations, but we now know that app-based systems are opening up all kinds of opportunities for providing transit services in places that maybe aren't conducive to conventional fixed routes. So, I think there's a lot of questions about how these maybe should be structured, where are the right environments for them, and what role technology is going to play. But really looking into the future, I think there's some big questions about who's going to operate these systems. Is this going to remain a service that's in the public domain, or is the private sector going to play an increasing role, as we're seeing with TNCs and such as Uber and Lyft? And I think there's a number of opportunities, but also some risks in this realm. So, well, on the risk side, to sort of share a pessimistic anecdote, I had the opportunity in grad school to study traffic and transportation systems in Nairobi, Kenya. And Nairobi is an interesting case study because if you look back to the past, it was a colony of the British Empire, and then up to the 1960s, the British operated a very formal, organized bus system that covered the whole system in an organized way. And when the country gained independence, there were other political priorities, and the system was underinvested. And over time, the private sector rose to serve unmet needs. And an unregulated or informal market for shared taxis, in Kenya they're called matatus, in most developing countries there's some form of this, emerged to compete and serve the need that the fixed routes weren't serving. And what ended up happening is they would compete directly against the bus routes in the most profitable corridors, driving them out of business. And their motive was not to serve the public good, but to turn a profit. And they operate in cartels that are not really interested in the public benefit, but to maximize profit. They serve an important public role, no doubt, but there's a lot of effort now to try to reorganize the system in a way that makes more sense for the social needs of that city. And I think looking forward, there's a risk that private entities that have the ability to compete with public transit may cherry pick off the most profitable corridors in a network, leaving our public transit agencies with holding the bag for the collector, the feeder systems that are not as profitable but make the whole system work, right? Transit works as a network, and that there may be certain corridors that, that you could actually make money on, but generally in developed countries, our transit systems as a whole require subsidy to operate and serve all the other social benefits that we realize. But there's a lot of opportunities for optimism, and some of these have to do with collaborations to serve places and users who are not currently being well served by conventional transit systems. And I think an example here in Massachusetts is the pilot program between MBTA's paratransit system and Uber and Lyft to expand opportunities and service and accessibility to people with disabilities. So I'm sort of wrapping up. I want to take this to a vision of the future that is a possible outcome, and that's this idea of mobility as a service. And it seems to be that there's a trend towards providing services that we use as a subscriber rather than owning. And this concept of mobility as a service is to think of a platform that would unify all of your transportation options in a single platform to communicate and pay for these systems, so that rather than having a bus pass, a bike share subscription, an Uber app on your phone, and having to make those distinct decisions every time you travel, there would be a unified platform that would help you navigate those and maybe pay for them in a unified way. And this has been experimented with already in Helsinki and Finland, the idea that you could be a subscriber and that the system would take care of all your needs. But there's a lot of questions about what this would look like and what this should look like in terms of serving the needs that we would hope from a transit system for the future. So some questions to sort of leave you with are, one, recognizing that a lot of transit investments that we make have long-lasting impacts, long after the conventional time period for analysis or time horizon for planning. You know, what are the visionary investments that we want to make or need to make now to realize our goals for the future? And especially in the context of a bigger spectrum of modes that we're likely to see for different types of systems, different types of communities, different types of users, and different types of contexts, who's going to be responsible for providing them? Is this going to all fall under the public domain, or what kind of partnerships need to be constructed between public entities and private providers to realize the benefits to society that we want without the potential shortcomings? And particularly in the context of mobility as a service, what is this platform going to look like? Who's responsible? Who's the broker for it? Is this something that should be a public platform that is managed by a public entity, or is this something we should leave to the free market to develop on its own? And I think there are a lot of different ways that this could play out, and it's unclear what the future will exactly hold. So I'll leave you with those thoughts, and I'm eager to hear what the questions and discussion are to follow. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Gonzalez. Certainly, decisions that we make in and around transit are going to shape the future indeed. And nowadays we hear certainly a lot more with respect to the idea of active transportation, in particular, the links between pedestrians, bicycles, and the connection with public health and everything that it means, the opportunity that the transportation sector has in terms of improving health systems here in the United States as well. One of the ways that we talk about getting there is through the idea of how people make decisions about the mode by which they're going to travel. Our next panelist is going to talk a little bit about the way that people make decisions in and around mode choices, and in particular, she's going to talk a bit about incentivizing mode choices and what opportunities might exist in that front. So our next panelist today is Professor Song Gao. She's an associate professor at the University of Massachusetts. She has her doctorate from MIT and has been for decades doing work in the area of systems modeling with respect to mode choice decision making. So Song, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mike, for the introduction. So thank you, Eric, for introducing the background of transit and emerging mobility services so that I can talk about the other side of the coin, which is the demand for transportation services and how we can manage it better. So a central theme of a mobility service is that, given that a traveler wants to go from A to B, how can we make the trip, fast, convenient, and cost-effective? How about we step back and ask another question? So does this traveler have to travel from A to B? So could she travel to a closer place, or could she actually cancel a trip at all? If she has to make the trip from A to B, does she have to do it during peak hours? If she has to, does she have to drive along in her nice car, or she could take other forms of, many forms of transit, or even, biking. So as we all observe, the demand for transportation is not fixed. So it derives from the demand to participate in socio-economic activities like going to work and visiting friends, and how, whether and when the travel is executed depends a lot on the quality of service of various travel options, including not traveling at all. So when we talk about how the transit and mobility services can be made more efficient using the new technologies, etc., we should also look at the other side of the coin, which is the demand, and how we can manage it. So demand management is not something new. One of the most discussed demand management strategies, probably also most controversial ones, is congestion pricing. So congestion pricing is this based on this idea of charging users for the full cost that his or her travel incurs. So including the cost to him or herself and the cost imposed on other users due to congestion. And the aim is to curb excessive demand and make the best use of existing facilities. London, Singapore, and Stockholm are among the few major cities of the world who have where the congestion charging scheme is in place in an area-wide fashion. So, for example, in London, that if you want to drive your personal cars in the central London area from 7 a.m. to 6 p.m., you have to pay £11.50, and if you drive more polluting cars, you pay more. However, congestion pricing is pretty controversial due to a number of reasons, including the general aversion to charges or more charges. We already pay enough tax, and why charge more? There's also the concern of equity. So in that it is viewed by critics as giving perks to high-income users at expenses of low-income users. So an alternative of demand management is that instead of charging people for using the congestion-inducing or more polluting travel options, for example, driving alone, we could reward people for using the less congestion-inducing and less polluting travel options. So there have been quite a number of pilot studies, studying of reward people for making good transportation choices at different scales, and one of the most notable ones was conducted in the Netherlands back in 2006, the so-called peak avoidance experiment. So it was done in one of the most congested highways in Netherlands, and in 13 consecutive weeks, about 400 volunteers were offered the opportunity to earn some either cash reward or credits towards purchasing some smartphone if they switch from driving along in peak hours to other options, including driving off-peak hours or taking other modes or working from home. So over the 13 weeks, they found that between 30 and 40% of the participants actually switched to a different either travel time or mode. And a more back to home, a close to home example is a research project that the researchers at UMass and MIT are conducting, sponsored by the Department of Energy, to develop an app that could nudge people towards more energy efficient and system efficient travel choices in terms of mode and departure time, route, trip making, and even driving style. So the design principle is that the incentives will be based on real-time information that we collect from the system, So it's adaptive to the actual traffic condition. So for example, you might get more incentives or more rewards by switching from driving to taking a bus right after a major highway accident than during normal conditions. Okay? And because it's delivered or the system is carried out through the app, there's no additional infrastructure needed. So we have actually evaluated the system based on a simulation of the greater Boston area, and we have seen pretty promising savings in both travel time and energy consumption from some preliminary results. So, Eric mentioned that as the transit and mobility as service emerges, and we have this landscape that's changing and we're not sure about, and we definitely desire a scenario where rides are shared and single occupancy driving is minimized. But to achieve this goal, I think we need of course, a suite of policy, planning, management, and operation tools. So I think positive incentives, such as those in the Dutch experiment and in the UMass MIT research projects, are probably as important as, if not more important than, the negative incentives, such as congestion charging, in managing the demand. Okay, so that concludes my presentation, and thank you for your attention.
So what we thought we would do is see if any members of the commission have any questions or comments based on the initial presentation before we get to the listening session with the audience. So I don't know if anybody wants to follow up on anything. Please, go ahead.
Good afternoon. Thanks for helping educate us. I guess the question to both of you would be, if you were sitting in our shoes and you could advocate for or make sure we included something in your realm, something related to mobility as a service and active transportation, and what would it be and why?
I'm going to pass it to me first. I think that there's, looking 20 years ahead, it's hard to know what exactly the precise technologies will be. But I think that there's sort of common goals that we've had in the past and will continue to have in the future about equitable and sustainable. And sustainable, I mean not only environmentally sustainable, but also economical and socially equitable outcomes, is that the policy structure needs to be leading the way. We need to get ahead of the technologies so that there's some framework for, as new things emerge, there's a framework for it to all fit in. And so there's a pattern in transit. I hate to pick on transit because this is a problem in other domains as well. There's a pattern that a lot of systems are sort of trying to continue to provide the service they've always provided. Most of the bus routes in most cities follow the same lines as the streetcar lines that they replaced. And there isn't often a lot of thought about reorganization. Sometimes there is, but there isn't often a lot of thought about, is the service we're providing really making sense for the needs of today and tomorrow, or are we just trying to sustain what we've always done? And the risk of that is that as needs change, you can find yourself with an obsolete kind of system, and that as needs change, it also creates challenges for continuing to sustain provision. And so, a negative outcome of this is something we're seeing in the Pioneer Valley. PVTA has had to cut back services because there's too many operations for the revenues that are coming in, and that just the things aren't adding up. And a challenge is that they're having to cut buses from congested urban cores to continue running empty buses in the suburbs because there's a political need to provide service everywhere. And maybe fixed route bus services in the surrounding towns isn't what they need to provide the most effective service, right? So we need to think about the way we manage the public side of transit as broader than just keeping the buses running, and as managing the spectrum of choices that we have. And I don't have a clear answer for whether the demand responsive system should be private or public or whatever, but I think that as public agencies and a public role is to get out ahead of that
and recognize that needs are going to change, and the technologies to meet those needs are also going to change, and that actually should provide more opportunities than risks.
Yeah, actually, I would like to follow up on Eric's comment about looking at a broad range of options. So we know that actually Eric mentioned that there's the chance of incorporating ride-sharing services like Uber and Lyft and try to see whether they can complement transit. So I think there's definitely great opportunity there, and there have been quite some pilot studies over this country. I know that in Colorado and in Florida, a few other places. So of course there are lessons learned along the way, but looking at I think this is really a good way to solve the first mile, last mile problem, so that people view transit not just as this inconvenient and things that you have to do when you have no other choices, but a very attractive option. And one observation I have made so far, I think Eric mentioned this before, like what is the sort of operator of those kind of services? So far it's been like just really purely private. You have Uber and Lyft, but their goal is not necessarily perfectly aligned with public goals. Their goal is to make profit. So therefore, for let's say Uber or Lyft, they want to have as many drivers as possible in their fleet, and so they can take commission from the revenues. But from public viewpoint, I think we want to have the adequate number of vehicles that will operate in the most efficient way. So that's not necessarily, in the interest of Uber itself. So maybe I think some kind of public-private partnership, or even a total public ownership of mobility as a service, could be, yes, definitely a good candidate for a future solution. Yeah.
Other questions or thoughts? Please go ahead, Tim.
Just if I could, it's interesting that you both talked more about the management than the infrastructure itself. I came up from Worcester today to get to Lowell, and there isn't infrastructure for me to make that trip very easily. How do you see that as an issue Commonwealth-wide? Do we kind of utilize all the different forms of transportation to better address the needs of kind of crisscrossing the state in multiple directions? Or is there an infrastructure need to connect in different kind of communities that may not be part of it currently?
I mean, I was careful to talk about visionary investments and not visionary infrastructure investments, because I think it's broader than that, but I think infrastructure actually is a really important piece. And it's tricky to enter that conversation without starting to get tied to specific projects, right? But I think if you think about the subway system in Boston or in a lot of great cities, it's hard to imagine the same system. If we went back, if we had today a city without it, it's hard to imagine building it from scratch, because the costs are so great and the benefits are realized over such a long period of time that a lot of cost-benefit analysis methods and time horizons are too short to really realize all those benefits, but that the benefits do realize themselves over a long time. I think when it comes to infrastructure, we have to be kind of smart about what kind of infrastructure we're investing in, and that there are ways of building things that can be upgraded into the future, and there's ways of building things that can sort of build yourself into a corner. And that, well, I'm going to pick on the Green Line, right? It's our oldest subway line, and it sort of shows its age, right? It's sort of hard to imagine. We could update some signaling things, but there's track geometries that are really a challenge. That's one that maybe requires sort of reimagining what that right-of-way should look like. But there's other types of infrastructure investments that have more to do with the technologies, and those are going to evolve over time. And so I think it's important to think sort of in abstract sense is to think about building infrastructure base that has some flexibility for the future and doesn't build us into a corner, but for the things that are fixed and hardwired, that they support sort of a vision that we collectively share, right? So if Lower to Worcester is something that collectively as a Commonwealth we think needs to be better tied together with other types of alternatives, that might make a lot of sense, and then that's something that we build, and the future will respond to that. right? I mean, in a lot of ways, the future we build towards is something that we plan for.
Tony?
First, I want to thank Professors Gonzalez and Gao for excellent presentations, tour de force on both the role of the different modes and on the basic problem which I, as an economist, worry about, congestion pricing, right? What to do about it. I guess the thing that I find myself grappling with on this commission is that it's going to be hard to know what's going to actually happen until it starts to happen. And I wonder if you would have any advice as to how to manage that dilemma.
You are allowed to say no.
Well, because I don't know any better, I'll say something. I think there's a lot of strategies that you can take on that can be adaptive and responsive. It's not that we decide today what the congestion price should be 20 years from now. I mean, we won't get it right. In fact, we're not very good at predicting the future. We will almost certainly be wrong if we try to predict precisely what the outcomes will be. But we can make plans that we want to build towards, and then there has to be a feedback loop on it. So if the route that we want to go towards is an incentive system, there's a structure for it that we can think about in terms of anticipating what the needs might be. It may be unclear what the magnitudes or which mode we're going to try to incentivize will be, but having sort of a platform for being able to respond in different ways is going to be useful. So in a lot of ways, the technologies for fare collection, for example, are allowing different types of fares to be charged than were possible in the past, right? Electronic fare payment systems allow you to charge differently by time of day or by origin destination pair, and maybe we don't utilize those capabilities today, but we have an infrastructure that will allow us to do it when we want to.
Well, I don't have any better answers, but just add to my point that I think the exercise of trying to come up with a number of different possible scenarios would be a good way to try to cope with the uncertainty of the future, which we will, of course, never know for sure what will happen. So, yeah, that's just my brief one.
Carly, did you want to?
I'm all set, thank you.
All right. Well, thank you very much to both professors for a great opening for this session. So you've all been very wonderful about sitting and listening to us. Now it's our turn to listen to you. So I believe that numbers were distributed. You going to call the numbers? You want me? How are we going to? Okay. Okay. So for some reason, we decided to make number 30 the first one to see if anyone's awake on a Friday afternoon. So whoever has number 30 can go to the. There we go. Put the microphone up. Great. Thank you.
Thank you. So my name is.
If you could, yes, if everyone could just identify themselves. If you're just you, that's fine. If you're associated with an organization, that would be great too.
So my name is Chuck Arnold. I live in downtown Lowell. I'm a member of the Lowell Bicycle Coalition. And forgive me, I don't have any prepared statement. This is going to be kind of stream of consciousness. But one theme that came up in this was the idea of transportation equity. And I'd like to propose perhaps the most democratic and equitable vehicle ever invented is the bicycle. And I'm thinking in particular of the situation currently in a lot of Europe, where, in Copenhagen or Amsterdam, where there exists an infrastructure that almost literally everybody can ride to where they have to be within a reasonable distance. For instance, I saw an article today that the Dutch Prime Minister rode his bike to the Dutch palace to form a new government. So it's across all levels of society. And I wonder if you would comment, first off, the Commonwealth doesn't have a substantial amount of bike infrastructure. We have bits and pieces here and there, but it doesn't seem to be done in a networked way or a way that seems to allow, for people now to get where they have to be across all stratas of society. It's not just, well-off people with nice bikes who are happy to ride in traffic. And I wonder if you'd comment how we can improve our bike infrastructure for the future. Thank you.
So, I mean, in general, we haven't been commenting back, but I do want to say this because I'm going to actually use this to put in a pitch. We are actually preparing, we by law at MassDOT have a statewide bicycle and pedestrian advisory committee. And it has not been refreshed in many years and has a small number of people who are sort of full-time associated with advocacy. Right now, there is a call for membership of the Massachusetts Bicycle and Pedestrian Advisory Committee out on the mass.gov website. We would love to get fresh insights from folks. So as I said, the commission isn't really in doing a plan business, but MassDOT is. We are responsible to create both a statewide bike plan and a statewide pedestrian plan. And the state capital plan that was just approved, the 5-year plan, sets aside $60 million for bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure, specifically to make sure that there's resources to begin to implement the plan. There's a lot more incentive to be involved in a planning process if there's some money on the table. So we actually, without knowing what the investment should be, sort of structured it that way. So anyone in the audience who is interested in that, there's some of my staff here. Steve Wolf, Steve, if you can stand up and kind of wave. Steve Wolfel's the Deputy Director of our Planning Department. And also, if you know other people who aren't here today who would be interested, they can go on the website. But we really do want to get folks from different parts of the state, more urban parts, more rural parts, folks who may just like biking or walking, but may not be, a full-time advocate or involved. And I think that is part of getting us to do a better job because, we're one department that sort of has a lot of responsibilities and we can't really understand the granular level of biking and walking needs, but we can do better than we currently do. I don't deny that.
Could I ask Professor Gonzalez to speak to the idea of the bike as a transportation equity tool?
So, I opened up the remarks saying that transit is not the be-all, end-all, and I had that particularly with active transportation modes in mind because if somebody can walk or cycle to where they're going instead of getting on a vehicle that consumes some kind of fossil fuel or their energy source, that seems like often a win and probably costs less and has all kinds of other public health benefits. And it's worth mentioning that every transit rider at some point is a pedestrian or cyclist to get to or from that mode, and so I think that these things are sort of integrally connected, inherently connected, and that so the development of both must be done hand in hand. So I don't disagree with you on that. We can debate whether or not for particular trips the bicycle or the bus is better or more democratic. I mean, there are some people who physically are unable to bike. There are places that are hillier than others are flatter. But I think your point is very, very on point. That there's a big role for those modes to certain that transit and mechanized transportation is not necessarily the primary solution.
Great.
Yeah, I just want to add that, when we think about heroes, like maybe the electrical bike will be the solution. Right?
It might be a good middle ground.
Yeah.
True. Let's see. In the week after next, the Pioneer Valley in Western Mass is launching an all-electric assist bicycle sharing network. So all 500 of the bikes in the network will be electric assist bikes because they came to the conclusion that both because of distance and topography, that would best attract people to trying to use the bicycle. Okay, do we have a number 31? Perfect. Come on up. Bingo.
Hello, you can tell I work with seniors. I'm Debbie Suriani. I'm the director of the Chelmsford Senior Center, and we run a transit service for folks to get to medical appointments. They get to grocery stores, they get to visit family, friends, come to be active in the community center, and we find that we are in more and more need. You said to look at the future. The future of course, seniors is the huge population. 20% of Chelmsford alone will be 60 and up by 2020. So if we're not moving those people, getting them out and engaged in the community, they'll become dependent rather than independent. And that's what we're looking forward to helping people continue to be independent. And transportation is a major part of that piece. So I'm basically here to speak to people and let people know that, but also to invite people in this room to and let us be on your side. The directors, the regional directors in this area are all very excited. I know we have a few in the audience to partner together to create a regional approach, to look at how we can get people around and at our economic centers to be spending their money, to enjoy their lives, to be active and involved in the community. So I really thank you for listening. I appreciate it very much. And I welcome you to use us.
Yeah, and I
So-
would say whether you or if others in the audience, we have definitely looked at demographic data. It definitely shows an aging Commonwealth. I think there is a lot of interest in the commission, and if folks have thoughts, not necessarily, again, not a specific project, but thoughts about principles or recommendations or policies that would help our transportation system better serve the needs of an aging population, we would love to hear those recommendations today, or just thoughts. They don't have to be fully formed recommendations.
I will keep thinking on that.
Thank you. We would appreciate it.
Thank you.
Echo something on that. I just want to echo what you said about among all the different needs for seniors is the health transportation, and we didn't talk about that earlier, but it's a real challenge, and that the landscape now of transportation to healthcare is very fragmented, and that in some communities people are really being left without good opportunities for that, and it's something that I think is a role that transit could be playing better, and maybe there's other solutions for. I saw some statistics in some communities, the percent of missed appointments that are attributed to a transportation problem are more than 50%. So it has real implications for people's quality of life.
Thank you.
I agree, absolutely. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next. Yeah, should have a 32 out there. Thought we gave away more than 2 numbers. All right, well, folks don't have numbers, but by listening to the conversation, want to jump in, even though you didn't get one, we're happy to just take folks on a first come, first served basis.
Well, it's 33.
No, 33. Sorry, great. I thought we gave away more than one. 33, great.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Secretary. Thank you to the Commission for coming to Lowell. My name is Jim Scale, and I'm the Administrator of the Lowell Regional Transit Authority. I want to thank the professors for the great comments and insight. You know, I was actually thinking of other things to come here and talk about, but when I heard your overall goal of the commission, I had a couple of thoughts, just quick thoughts. One is that you know, public transit agencies sometimes are looked at as being the panacea or the solution for all the problems of public transportation. And unfortunately, we're not. You know, we can help solve a lot of the problems, but I look around the room here today and I see Debbie from the Chelmsford Council on Aging. I see Stephanie Cronin from TMA out in the Middlesex, and I know we have a great TMA out in Acton and Maynard. And I think those are the solutions going forward, that we all need to engage the private partners and the public partners to try to solve public transportation. And obviously, sometimes we overlook even our local partners, whether it's a city or town, to really help us out. And I think about Debbie, and I think about some of the other towns that the LRTA serves, and they do a great job. And I guess what I'm trying to say is that the solution to improving public transportation is really going to be getting everybody together, whether it's public or private, to help solve the public transportation challenges that we have going forward. You know, whether you're at MassDOT with the Secretary Pollock, or whether you're at a smaller agency like the LRTA, you know, we can't do it alone. And sometimes we're looked as being the fault, but at the same time, as we go forward, we really need to engage all the partners like you're doing here today. So those are my comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Number 34. Is there a 35? There we go.
Hi, Jacinda Barbahan. I'm a planning board member in Bedford, Mass. I have a couple of general questions and ideas around. I think one of the frustrations we have at the local level when we're trying to plan services like these senior opportunities to go where they need to go is that the borders don't line up with the realities of the economies on the ground, and that jurisdictional limitations are really hindering our ability to to create systems that are efficient and useful for people so that they would use them more. That's one of the things. And the other thing is, just had a question about whether or not, as a commission, you will have a philosophy or some targets with regards to how you're going to divide percentage-wise your attention to different modes of transportation. And that can be on the regional level or on the streetscape. So, you know, on a streetscape, we have the complete streets concept where, you know, you have bikers, walkers, cars, transit. But are you going to have mandates to say in future infrastructure designs, X percentage of landscapes on the right-of-way should be set aside for transit facilities, for fast lane services, or bike lanes, so people can use completely alternative form of transportation. Those are two of my thoughts.
Do you have any thoughts on whether we, the commission or we, Massachusetts, should have that kind of, how can we balance the needs of the different modes?
Well, one of the tricky bits is that because of technology, and we don't know exactly what those modes are going to look like in 20 to 40 years, is to plan for that unknown bit. But, well, I have kind of an inkling that it's going to fall somewhere in that private, public, mini, 6 to 8 person scale service that's getting people from one suburban hub to another, as opposed to a transit system or service built around the town I live in. Does that answer?
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense, actually. Thank you. Is there a 36?
Hi, my name is Stacy Butel. I'm on staff at Walk Boston, and I'm actually going to talk broader, not just about pedestrian issues today. But one of the things that I heard about from some of the speakers that were just talked about were, if we think about metrics that we talk about with transportation systems as being successful, you talked a lot about choice, you talked about resiliency, social equity, inclusion, physical mobility. One thing that I thought was missing was safety. So I want to make sure, and I know that we all think about safety as a transportation method, but that's something that's particularly important to us as pedestrian fatalities and serious injuries continue to move upward, whereas in a motor vehicle, it's not the same with all modes. So I would like to add that to the list of things to think about when we're thinking about the success of a transportation system and what that might look like. I also wanted to add that we've perhaps need to think about less about sort of mode-specific things, like we have a bike plan and a pedestrian plan and a water transit plan, and thinking more about what the goal might be. Is it to get to work on time? Is it to get to school? Is it to get to play, to recreate? And to think less about necessarily how, but making sure that those networks exist and that choice is available. And again, as many of us, we're all thinking about how that might happen, but rather than thinking about it and have, as we have traditionally, as biking, walking, transit, thinking more about it as a place-to-place sort of situation would be something to think broadly about. And then finally, I just didn't want to lose the concept of the fact that part of life is the journey, right? And I'm going to sound potentially philosophical, but if we think, we've been talking a lot about efficiency and getting there fast and less traffic and all these types of things, but part of it's the journey. And walking from one place to another, or riding your bike from one place to another, you're going to run into someone that you haven't seen before. So I hope that as we continue to think about transportation on the state level, as we're thinking about not making it impersonal, but reminding ourselves that we're going to place to see each other, and that it's okay if it takes a little bit longer than we think it might.
Great, thank you very much. 37?
Good afternoon. Thank you, Secretary Pollack and the panelists and professors, and for hosting this event. I really appreciate it. My name is Lisa Hemmerly. I'm the Director of Economic Development for the City of Cambridge. And I really appreciate that, the Commission is looking at everything through the lens of inclusivity and equity, because, we struggle in Cambridge trying to figure out, even now, how to get retail and restaurant employees to the city who can't, afford to live in the city. And so we're really struggling with that issue right now, especially as they're trying to make multiple bus connections and off schedules and working until 1 in the morning when the trains and the buses are no longer working, and how do they get home? So I really appreciate that you're all looking through those lenses. From an economic development standpoint, I've been trying to think of, as I talk to other municipalities and the issues that they're all struggling with, if we can solve multiple issues at the same time, which I'm sure you're all looking at. But, as a constraining factor for transportation, economic development and trying to bring more employers to the area and, continuing to be able to attract employees, when they're sitting in traffic or stuck on a broken train, et cetera. Are there ways, as we're talking about incentives and disincentives, are there ways to incent the employers, to really think about, flex time and working from home? And although I'm not a huge fan of working from home because, we're all struggling, to make those social connections, are there satellite offices, that can be incented in the smaller municipalities that are struggling for commercial development, so that they're getting a tax base, their employees aren't necessarily having to drive into Cambridge and Boston every day, but they're still getting that, that social interaction with each other and with their, their fellow teammates. And then you're getting the reduction of that cut-through traffic, which I hear a lot of the smaller municipalities really complaining about a lot. So I just wanted to say thank you so much for doing this, and thanks for listening.
Thank you. 38.
Thank you. And thank you, Secretary Pollack. It's good to see you here in the Merrimack Valley again, and to the commissioners and the professors. Honestly, it's very interesting. Can you just excuse me. I'm Andrea Leary from the Merrimack Valley TMA. I also run a TMA in the North Suburban area, the North Shore, and the newest TMA in Somerville. And so I'd like to talk a little bit about the technology. I did not know that that's what you were going to talk about, Professor Gao, but honestly, mobility as a service, I think, has a great opportunity. And I think that in terms of investing in technology, such as what Professor Gonzalez was talking about, that we need to be looking today at what's available for technology, and then how can you build on that for tomorrow. And in terms of incentivizing folks, such as, it doesn't always have to be a monetary incentive. I do a lot of surveys with a lot of businesses and a lot of employees that we work with, and time is a huge incentive for people. So if you look at technology such as Waze, and how can that be used to incentivize people to make a better choice? Oh, there's traffic on I-93 because there's been some kind of an accident, and pushing out information about better options that that could be used. So what I'd really like folks to come away with is to look at scalable technology and how that can incentivize people to do the right thing. In terms of congestion pricing, I do think that is kind of an equity situation for folks. And what ends up happening in equity is, I think we have to look at all people. I work with a lot of people, not that are high-end employees or, on the lower socioeconomic end, but a lot of middle-class people. And, so where there's subsidies for, lower socioeconomic folks and people who are, high income earners, they can afford these choices, but the middle class can't. And so I think that when we're looking at congestion pricing, we have to be mindful of that. Also, middle class employees also maybe don't necessarily have the ability to change their schedule to work off hours. They have to kind of work the hours that they're told they have to work in order to have an income. So that's why I think that in terms of technology, if we start to build that scalable technology and look how the technology can incentivize people to save, some time, that they'll start to make better choices, and that will be beneficial. And certainly, before I sit down, I'd also like to thank Administrator Scanlon for his support of transportation management associations. They are a public-private partnership, and they are, they have opportunities to really support the public. The public can't do it all. There needs to be some private investment as well. And, transportation management associations provide that opportunity. And, when Administrator Scanlon was talking about the bus system and the buses can't be everything and all things to all people, I think that, again, going back to the technology, as we're looking to the technology to see, oh, there's an asset here, there's a bus asset here, there's a paratransit asset here, there's a Waze asset here, here's, is there an opportunity to even include, private citizens who are in carpooling who, maybe can pick folks up. Those are the things that we have to be thinking outside the box to say, how can we use that technology to expand our assets? Particularly, for folks in suburban locations and in rural locations, the bus system can't be everything to everyone, because when it tries to be, it really ends up serving no one. And so, because it's too long. And so these kinds of things, I think, can really start to look at, here's a route, and, what's going on. There's some really interesting things happening in North Carolina around, mobility as a service and bus routes, and Uber and Lyft vehicles kind of circling the bus routes and making for people to get to those last few miles, or those first few miles in many cases. So I'd like to thank you all. This is a tremendous amount of time that you're donating to the Commonwealth and to this problem. And, really, I think that folks really appreciate it, because it's everywhere you hear traffic, traffic, traffic. And so we need to start to look at this problem so that, our economy is not strangled by it. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your time coming. 38? Oh, sorry, 39? Did we give out a 40? Great.
Hi, 40 rhymes with 2040. I'm Josh Ostroff, Partnerships Director at Transportation for Massachusetts, and I thank you all for being here today. We're a statewide coalition just advocating for better mobility. I think our goals are very consistent with the governor's intent in establishing the commission, and we're pleased in January when it was done so, and thank you for being here, Madam Secretary and commissioners and speakers. And so interesting to hear a lot of current topics discussed when we think of how to solve issues of congestion or how to better help people make rational decisions. So the 2 points I'd want to make are that it's not easy to make recommendations for 2040, but it may even be harder to figure out how we get there from December 1st, 2018 to 2040, because the Commission and the administration and the Secretary will have some real challenges in what are those short-term actions that get us to a sustainable future where we reap all the benefits of a well-run transportation network. The thing I'd ask to consider is what signals do we send to people to help them make rational decisions? I think one of the best things that's happened in transportation is the democratization of data. When open data became a thing at MassDOT several years ago, and we see this in transit providers around the country, that really has helped people make wise decisions. But I sometimes worry that some of the things that we do now to prioritize convenience of drivers are working at cross purposes with a lot of the information that the Commission is developing. So when we're concerned about climate and health and safety, if we send signals to drivers saying, here's how long it's going to take you to get from Waltham to Lowell, or whatever it may be, in minutes, we're not telling them about any of the other costs involved in their travel choice. So I wonder whether there are ways to provide some of the feedback to people so they understand I don't know what that metric would be, whether it's, tons of greenhouse gases or other measures. But I think we want to make sure that people have good access to information to make these rational short-term decisions that will have long-term implications, because very quickly the short-term becomes the medium-term, becomes the long-term, because people make their choices, and then we see travel patterns, and then that becomes the facts on the ground, and we can't really escape from that. So I'm really interested to see the Commission's work, and thank you for donating the time to do it. And I know you're not here to engage, and you're also not here to talk about projects. Otherwise, I'd advocate for restoring the Middlesex Canal, but that ship has sailed. Thank you so much. Sorry.
Thank you. Good fun.
Yeah.
Is there 41? That's me. Perfect.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you for coming to Lowell. I'm Stephanie Cronin with the Middlesex 3 Coalition. We're a public-private partnership regional economic development organization. I've got 5 points, but they'll be really quick. First of all, thank you to the professors for your points. I have 2 items to either add to that or to stress. The first is the issue of predictability. I live in Dunstable, Mass. Very small town. You probably don't know where it is. When I want to go to Boston, I can choose the 3 or 4 stations that I go to, and I usually go to the one where I think might have parking. I want to get rid of my car, but I don't know. So that's the issue, is I want to know where I can go to find parking so I can get rid of it and I can get on public transportation. The second is, and there's some economic development people in the room, bear with me. There's a program called Retail Best Practices. And the reason I mention that is there's a point that they mentioned where they basically say people don't want to feel stupid. And you feel that way sometimes when you're taking public transportation, not the T, but when you're going on buses, and especially private buses, you don't know, should I stand there, should I stand there? You don't want to miss it because it comes every hour. So it's really just the idea of signage. And that's not really 2040, but it's just a general theme. And then the third is, so we are the Middlesex 3 TMA. We didn't start out as a transportation organization. We created our TMA as a response to the businesses that they need transportation. The business community wants to be involved in the conversation. And I thank Jim Scanlon for his remarks as well. We want to, the business, it's a workforce development issue. And I look at the maps of transportation, and it looks so smooth, so clean. The issue is that I don't have a transportation, I didn't have a transportation background. Whenever I felt as though I had a handle on transportation, it's as though I flipped the page and there are all these other resources and programs, and I didn't know where to go, and we're still struggling with it. So it's just not as clear-cut and as obvious to figure out where to go to solve your problems. So the point is that businesses want to be involved, and if we can have a more clear-cut roadmap. And then 2 other quick points. One is seed money. Businesses are interested in shuttles to get their employees to work, but they don't want to be the first and the only ones to take a step forward. They want to work with the public sector to have seed money to help get these shuttles off the road to see that they're going to be sustainable. And then the final one is legal issues. I hear from some businesses that they don't know whether this is violating DOR issues, whether they're able to provide this benefit to their employees or not. So they're just, I don't know if they're excuses or if they're just real questions, but some things are just not clear for some of the businesses. So thank you.
Thank you. 42?
Thank you, Madam Secretary. My name is Matthew Poirier. I'm from the U.S. Department of Transportation, Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration. And one of the points of the conversation I've heard so far is that we're really focused on point-to-point movement within the Commonwealth. And I think there may need to be some consideration about interstate movement of people across the lines. And so I think I'd challenge the Commission to think about what happens in 2040. What does a movement from someone from New Hampshire down to Logan Airport look like? How might TNCs might be involved? How might electric vehicles might be involved? How does highly automated vehicles, how do they look like? And what does the private market look like with operators like Greyhound, Peter Pan, just as a future consideration? Thank you.
Thank you. 43, perfect.
Hi, my name is Tad Staley, and I'm from Needham, way down in Needham, where I have led the bike advocacy group called Needham Bikes. And 10 years ago, with a group of other people, we started a rail trail project called the Bay Colony Rail Trail. It's conceived as a 7-mile trail from Needham to Medfield and with opportunities to go into Newton. And I'd just like to put in a plug for not rail trails per se, but as preserving essentially arteries. And apparently Massachusetts is one of the worst states in converting train tracks that are unused into publicly accessible recreational paths, because I'm not sure why. And so I'd encourage that investment, because it's not just about the bikes that could go on the trails or the walkers, or whatever. I think it's preserving corridors, because we don't know what kind of transportation we're going to be looking for in 2040. It could be hovercrafts, it could be motorized bikes, but you're preserving these corridors, and it doesn't have to be a huge expense. The Bruce Freeman Rail Trail is fabulous. I intend to go there after this, but it costs millions of dollars. We spent hundreds of thousands in Needham to get a mile done. But my request would be that at the moment it's very hard to get rail trails built. The town of Dover is struggling to get their 3 miles done because there's haggling over the contract with the MBTA. I would think it would be a no-brainer just to get that done, get towns preserving these corridors, and that's sort of a way of future-proofing the transportation. Thank you.
Thank you. 44?
Hi, thank you for being here like everybody else. So my name is Saipo Vari. I'm from Cambodian Mutual Assistance Solution here in Lowell. We serve minorities family who are socially diseconomic. I just want you to be considerate about languages. Like when we are, the last time I was helping a community member come to our programs, I kind of went on public transportation just to go through, run it down to see how it goes, if she can do it by herself. It was hard for me to even use the transportation. I was going from one side of town to the other side, and then I was thought, okay, if this was able, like if somehow like in the future, if a person can get on the bus or public transportation and they can choose their language, this way they can get off where they need to without having to miss their exit and whatnot. If that can be something that you can think about, that would be greatly appreciated. And also the other thing is, most of the community members that we serve have very low income. And how do we provide them transportation from one area to another? Like if they have to go to Boston to get their citizenship, to get applications for their green card and all that stuff, or to go to Lawrence when they're in here. What are the transportation options for them? Their income is very limited. So if you can think of something that we could actually provide for our community members to have access to these things, and adding language to that. And my last thought would be a campaign. Like how do we campaign-wise to educate drivers and bikers and walkers what is a safe and also compassionate way to travel? When I drive and I see, oh, there's traffic coming up, and I was like, how could there be traffic if we all are so thoughtful of each other? Okay, coming in, letting people. And not having road rage and things like that. So if we think about campaign worldwide of passing out, I feel like maybe that the traffic jams will be less and people's health will be less as well. Thank you.
Thank you. 44? Oh, sorry, 45? All right, so now I will say, if someone did not take a number, but has been inspired by sitting here and would like to weigh in with a thought or a comment, we'd be happy to hear from you. Just identify yourself when you stand up to the mic.
Hi, my name is John Wei Tommy. I'm a transportation planner for the Northern Middlesex Council of Governments, the regional planning agency here in Greater Lowell. I have two points that I want to share with you. The first is pedestrians, sidewalks. As a commission, don't forget that the sidewalk is a mode of transportation. And currently, it's up to individual cities and towns, DPWs, to fix them. And they get funding through our transportation improvement plans for individual sidewalk and intersection improvements. But there needs to be more uniformity throughout the Commonwealth as to how sidewalks can be designed and constructed so that pedestrians are safe at all times of the year, be it summer or winter, in any city or town in Massachusetts. My second point, I would like to let you know, it's this very seldom talked about area of transportation planning, freight planning. We have to look more into safety, transportation safety related to freight planning, including a cataloging of our truck stops and rest areas so that truckers and freight movers can feel safe and comfortable transporting goods and merchandise through our Commonwealth. Just as a reminder, don't forget about the freight.
Anyone else who did not take a number but has a comment or thought to share? All right. Then on behalf of my fellow commission members, on behalf of our chairman, Steve Kadish, who couldn't be here, I really want to thank everyone for coming out this afternoon. I certainly took a lot of notes, heard a lot of really great ideas and themes that are going to be helpful to the commission. I will take the opportunity for two public service announcements. One, again, is we are actively looking for, we have terrific people on our existing bike and pedestrian advisory committees, but we really are looking for a statewide group that represents all kinds of walkers and bikers, people who do it all the time, people who do it occasionally, people with different levels of ability, people who believe that sidewalks are part of the infrastructure, and you're absolutely right. We've been doing survey work, 92% are actually owned by cities and towns, only 8% by MassDOT. And not just those of you who are here today, but if you know other folks who would like to get involved, we do have a call for members out. And then the second thing I will just close with, and the commission will get briefed on this in July, but on Monday, the MBTA will begin the process of releasing a draft version of its plan for 2040, which is called Focus 40. It's a planning effort that has been underway actually for years. And this is the first time they are putting out in draft some actual recommendations. Lowell and this area is both has its own RTA, but is also part of the MBTA system through commuter rail, and many of the communities in the Merrimack Valley also share having a regional transit authority, a transportation management association, but also make use of the MBTA system. So as we put that out, it'll be out for public comment pretty much all summer. And so we really are hoping to engage folks, and if there's an opportunity for us to come back up here and talk to folks about that through other things that are going on, we're always happy to know about that. So again, thank you to everyone for coming and for helping the commission undertake the very important work that Governor Baker has asked us to do.